stars across our entire cosmic neighborhood, just as if they're riding a gigantic galactic tide. The best part about this, we have no idea what caused it. So, let's dive into the possibilities of the cosmic great wave. What are the theories? How do we even know it exists, since no spacecraft we've ever sent into the stars is far enough away to see the entire galaxy? What's the significance of a ripple far out in space, and even that goes beyond the lens of the telescope itself? Plus, a closer look at a tidbit from the European Space Agency that actually blew my mind, but that no one else is talking about for some reason or another. Join me as we unravel this and much more and enter the Codex Legendarium. I'm Shelby Melanson. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me once again for this live. We're still new to this, but I'm loving getting the chance to actually talk to you guys in person for once. Okay, let's get into it. A great wave is rippling through our Milky Way from the center of the galaxy, and we have no idea why. That's kind of a big deal, and yet I only saw just a handful of headlines, even though this happened just a few months ago this year. The European Space Agency actually announced it back in September of this year. So, maybe this is kind of a fitting metaphor, but think of it as like something literally tossing a rock into a pond and then watching the ripple, come out from the center. That's what we're dealing with here on a massive, enormous scale, right? So this is so big and it's so powerful that the ESA, in its official statement, like I said, actually likened this to a bunch of people in a stadium doing the wave, literally. Like, I find it hilarious, but it's actually a pretty accurate metaphor. I'm going to explain why in a little bit. But first of all, let's talk about a common question, right? How do we even see this and know that it's happening, considering it's A, so massive, and B, we are inside the galaxy that we are trying to observe, right? Let's not forget that. And we're not anywhere close to the center, more on that in a second. But again, something to consider here. There are challenges, to say the least. The images of the full Milky Way swirl are not actually photographs, right? I'm talking about the ones that you see on the old school, Mac computer wallpaper desktop, like those beautiful, gigantic zoomed out swirls of our galaxy. Those are artistic illustrations. They're not photographs. Because, again, no space probe we've ever sent is far enough away to escape the Milky Way, let alone enough to literally zoom out to that extent to get far enough away from it and see the entire galaxy in its entirety, right? The farthest thing we've ever sent out into space is actually Voyager 1. We launched that back in 1977, and since that time, as of November 2025, this year, it has traveled 170 AU. That's astronomical units. We talk about this a lot on this channel. Essentially, that's the measure from the sun to the Earth, right? So it's a big distance by what we understand and how we see things from our perspective, but it's a very infinitesimally small distance in the grand scheme of space. So as far back and for as long as Voyager 1 has been traveling, it's still a very literal drop in the bucket of the distance to get to the edge of the Milky Way. So, just for the sake of explaining the scale of this a little bit further, take this comparison. The edge of the Milky Way is 950,000 light years away from us, and one single light year, one out of that 950,000, equals over 63,000 AU, right? So 170 is a small fraction of a single light year, and that single light year is a small fraction to the edge of the Milky Way, right? It's huge and very difficult to wrap your head around. Okay, all that said, here's what we can see. Like, from our vantage point here on Earth and based on the technology that we now have access to. We can capture the core of the Milky Way because we're very far away from its central disk. Basically about essentially, my notes are going a little haywire here. Essentially, 26,000 AU away from the center, right? So that's the center of the Milky Way to the Earth, that distance. All you need to do this, and I do it on the regular myself, it's one of my favorite pastimes in the world, is a clear, cloudless sky away from light pollution and a decent camera and the ability to take a long exposure on a tripod. That's it. You can photograph the Milky Way. And this is the kind of Milky Way image that, not like the swirl that we see in classic images, but the big arch where you see the really rich orange color in the center and then it kind of pivots away to those blues and like light pinks, right? That kind of image. Beautiful landscape photography, some of my personal favorites, like I said. Okay, so, a quick point on that for my fellow astrophotographers, you probably already know this, but there's actually a point of the year called Milky Way season for photography purposes. This is essentially from March to September, which is the absolute best time of the year if you want to go out and see the Milky Way with your camera or your naked eye. And like I said, just focus on dark skies away from light pollution for that. Okay, but let's get back to the Great Wave and how we found it. Well, the photograph of the Milky Way is basically similar. Well, let me take a step back. Again, we photograph the Milky Way is similar to how space probes and other instruments get this information, right? So again, we just talked about how to capture it, by seeing it with your eye and also with a camera. This is basically how space probes and other, major technological instruments work, just on a much bigger scale. So, the Great Wave was discovered by the European Space Agency, specifically its Gaia space telescope, and that instrument has been around since 2013. It was recently retired when it passed basically its expiration date because it ran out of fuel this March, but it was out there, it was far out there for a long time, and because of that instrument, we know a lot more about the positions and movements of stars and other celestial bodies in the universe. Really, really cool stuff. We're going to get much more into this. Basically, the Gaia Space Telescope had one job: to chart the position of stars to a really, really extremely high degree of accuracy, and here's why. If you are able to chart the paths of celestial bodies and stars and other objects, basically over an extremely long time in an extremely precise way, long time relatively speaking here, you not only observe normal and expected patterns of orbit, but you can also notice motions that might not be so expected, right? So when you do this on a large scale, like I said, and you start noticing these significant changes in a movement, in star movement across a wide range of celestial bodies, that's kind of how you know that something there is amiss. Be that, there may be an object there that you can't see that's causing these additional movements. There may be some kind of gravitational field, causing trouble. There's something there. That's how we know. So this is how Gaia found the wave, by watching thousands of stars as they literally got pushed around by the force of this wave through the Milky Way, right? Let me read you a direct quote from the ESA explaining this. Quote, "Even if no spacecraft can travel beyond our galaxy, Gaia's uniquely accurate vision in all three spatial directions, 3D, plus 3 velocities, in other words, moving towards and away from us and across the sky, is enabling scientists to make these top-down and edge-on maps." So there you have it. That's how they do it. A quick side note on this. I know I touched on this a second ago, but this is really, really cool. The same process is effectively how a ton of space discoveries are made, right? So this concept of observing the area or the objects around an area of space that to kind of get a pinpoint or a closer idea of something else that you think is there but cannot see. So the most obvious example of this is with black holes, but it also shows up in other areas like the search for Planet X or Planet 9, depending on who you ask. You might have seen my video on this already, but if you haven't, check that one out. I loved doing that, and hopefully we're going to see much more coming soon, especially from the Space Telescope and observatory in Chile, right? So, anyway, back to the Great Wave. It's huge, to the point that it takes up a large area of the outer disk of the Milky Way galaxy. Like, stop and think about that for a second. It takes up a large part of the entire Milky Way, okay? As part of its statement on the discovery, the ESA released a few images that really help visualize the absolutely mind-boggling scale of this wave. Now, full disclosure, I'm still new to doing live streams, but for those who want to check this out, let me just take a second here to share the link in the live chat for those who do want to take a closer look. So, let me do that now. All right. Hopefully you all can see that. So, check it out. There are a couple of images on that webpage. They're quite striking, really, and they help illustrate this in ways that it's really otherwise hard to kind of wrap your head around and explain, okay? So, the stars that this wave impacts, we're talking across the entire, section of this Milky Way disk. They're located between 30,000 and 65,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way, right? So the center, they're located, within this range of the outside of it, okay? Now, again, we've talked about scales already, scales of distance, but that's an unfathomable distance for us here on Earth. We have no reference point whatsoever in order to wrap our heads around a distance of this scale. But compare that to the size of the Milky Way itself, right? We talked about this earlier. Like I said, it's something I really want to emphasize. Our galaxy is around 100,000 light years in diameter, meaning the entire width of the Milky Way swirl is 100,000 light years, meaning this wave is rippling through almost a third, or roughly maybe even a little over a third of the entire galaxy. Yeah, it's a big wave. That said, we already mentioned that this is difficult to wrap your head around, but what I really found helped me put into perspective was these images. So now that you've all had a second to take a look in the chat and pull that webpage up, hopefully, I want to actually go over the images for those that either can see it and follow along or can't see it, right? So these images illustrate two main views. The first is that the face of the Milky Way galaxy disk, right? So it's like the overview of the swirl, right? It highlights just how much of the galaxy this wave overlaps. You can see it in a really clear view in that, that just over a third zone visually is quite striking. So in another image, it also shows a side view where you can actually see the shape of the wave with one side tilting down and the other tilting up on either side. And you can see the ripples in the galaxy. It's incredible. So another quick fun side note on this, we've known since the 1950s that the Milky Way disk is actually warped, meaning it's not, a perfect flat, 2D-esque disk like you'd see on a CD, right? It's not like that. It's warped. The other thing is that it actually wobbles or teeters from side to side, a little bit like a spinning top, like, that amazing ending scene in Inception. That's the one that always comes to mind for me. But it literally wobbles like this, and it has for as long as we've ever been able to track it, right, through history. So whether that plays into the Great Wave or otherwise impacts it, we don't know. But let's get into some theories about what potentially started the wave. Like I said at the beginning, we really don't know. But there are suggestions, we'll call it that. So here's what the ESA threw into the hat as a possible explanation, right? They say it could have been a collision with a smaller dwarf galaxy, right? So basically something that would cause a large enough blast to ripple out into the rest of the cosmos. Now, again, keep in mind the scale of this, of how big a blast that would have to be. We're not talking about like a supernova explosion that's limited to one celestial body. We're talking about a collision with a galaxy, right? So that, on that scale, is something that could, in theory, potentially cause this, right? Others say it could tie into something called the Radcliffe wave, and this was basically a way smaller ripple in the Milky Way, and it was only about 9,000 light years long. And it starts around 500 light years away from our sun. So kind of relatively near in the span or the scope of these great distances that we're talking about. The thing is, it's located in a totally different area of the galaxy than the Great Wave that we're talking about today. So the jury is kind of still out on whether or not these two are actually related. Here's the other fun thing. We'll talk about a little bit of philosophical discussion about this at the end, so I'll save that for this part of the show. But also a quick side note as we go. So at the end of this spiel, once we get finished talking about the Great Wave, I'm going to be diving into the live chat that we have going on today. So if you have questions, if you have things you want to talk about, leave me a comment and we can chat about it towards the end of the show. Okay, let's get back to the Great Wave. Let's say it was caused by some unfathomably large explosion at some point in the distant, and I do mean distant, past, right? Not including the fact that looking through space is literally time travel and these other things. Stay tuned for a really cool episode that I have in the works on that, by the way. Okay. Besides all that, one paragraph of the ESA's statement on the wave kind of blew my mind. And I found it extra weird that not only did next to nobody, like no news outlets, no social media, basically anything, almost nobody talked about the Great Wave discovery at all, side of like 3 or 4 articles that I happened to see. But this next point, even the few that did talk about it, didn't talk about this part specifically. So let me just read you this quote, okay? Quote, "Because young giant stars and Cepheids move with the wave, the scientists think that the gas in the disk might also be taking part in this large-scale ripple. It is possible that the young stars retain the memory of the wave information from the gas itself, from which they were born." I know. Think about this, what this actually means. Even stars that formed after this hypothetical wave-causing blast, right? After the wave had already begun, they're moving with the wave because the gas and dust that formed them, that was still just gas and dust at that time, but then later transformed into a planet, held on to the memory of that explosion. Think about that. So because the gas and dust remember, the star remembers too, with the same motion and follows along, right? Isn't that crazy? Like, that's mind-blowing. And again, the fact that basically no one mentioned this is kind of beyond me. That's just, there are some moments in my studies and my research on the universe and the cosmos, and there is still so very much to learn, more than any one person could ever learn in a lifetime, as we have seen throughout the entirety of history, right? But this is one of those moments to me that just really highlights the absolute mystery and beauty and grandeur of space, right? How could you not be interested? How could you not be so curious about something like this? Okay, enough of my rambling. Let's switch gears. This would not be an episode of Codex Legendarium unless we talked about culture, legends, symbolism. So today, what about art? Let me just give a quick aside on this. If you've seen the show before, you know I'm a fan of something called poetic thinking, right? It's something that I hint at quite a bit in a lot of my discussions, though not by name. Oh, hold on just a second. There we go. It's something that I hint at quite a bit on a lot of my discussions, as I just said, though here's the thing. I'm actually considering doing a full episode all about this. You can let me know if it's something you want to hear after this description, but in any case. In its most basic form, it's essentially the belief that in order to learn, you have to acknowledge that you don't know it all, right? So you have to acknowledge that you have to recognize your limitations of human knowledge, right? Even if that's the collective of human knowledge. Essentially, scholars in ancient times would kind of literally and figuratively, sometimes literally, actually throw themselves before temples of learning and before God to ask for wisdom to learn, right? So if you compare that to the kind of modern thinking of like what we tend to believe now, which is that we essentially know it all, or science does, and when we get proven wrong, like even when something comes across to kind of disrupt our, existing beliefs, we don't always accept that. So anyway, I digress. This is the reason that I like bringing other elements into Codex episodes. So art, culture, mythology, because I think it helps kind of keep us creative and open-minded when it comes to science, which of course is a lot of what we talk about here. So that brings us back to the wave. If a wave is moving through the cosmos, well, okay, what does a wave represent, right? Especially a giant one. So maybe the obvious one, the biggest wave that we could possibly compare it to is something here on Earth, a tsunami, or perhaps an earthquake, right? These are typically highly symbolic of destruction, right? But that's not all. On the other side of this kind of wave symbolism, you also have the concept of like literally being able to weather the storm and ride the wave, right? So all of this got me thinking about Japan, essentially, and also other countries, quite a bit, like people from the Pacific Islands and other things. Essentially cultures that are, ocean-locked, and their entire livelihood, their existence, their way to survive is, tied very deeply into the ocean, right? So again, take Japan. They're super isolated also. So the ocean is, throughout most of history is pretty much what they had. So because of that, and by extension, waves are profoundly important symbols in Japanese art because of this, right? So you create based on what you know as an artist. So I kind of think that culture, because of that and, many other reasons, they understood something a little bit deeper about water, in that a lot of these kind of artistic representations, they kind of present the idea that water equals life, right? And also the cycle of life and change and motion. And specifically when it comes to waves in water, kind of a cleaning of the spirit. If you can withstand, challenges in your life or in your course of existence, you can come out the other side cleaner, right? Maybe the most obvious example of this, and something that I just had to talk about when I first started reading about this great wave, is the woodblock print, The Great Wave of Kanagawa, right, off Kanagawa. So you've seen it. It's one of the most famous artworks in the world. It basically depicts a physical entity, a wave, showcasing the resilience of the human spirit, right, literally riding the wave. So this kind of mirrors Japanese philosophy, and essentially I think the meaning to take away from it is find balance in chaos, right? So perhaps that's something that we can take away from a philosophical perspective about what we're seeing now with this great wave. What does that mean for our cosmos? Is this a period of, a chance to perhaps give us all the opportunity to reflect a bit on, that whole cleaning of the soul idea, right? Anyway, you'll have to let me know what you think, but I couldn't help but notice an interesting point of view on that one. So, with that said, let me dive into what you guys have been talking about in the live chat. So, bear with me a second. Let's see what we've been up to. Thank you all so much for joining me, by the way. I'm very new to this, but I'm loving it, and it's every single week. It's an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you all. If I know most of you already are aware of this, but the person replying to the comments every week on every episode is me, right? So I'm loving these conversations that we've been able to have. Okay, so, called the galactic current sheet. Oh, hey Lance, great to see you here. Yes, he's right. He says it's called the galactic current sheet. They know exactly what it is. It's the magnetic wave from the center projecting out. Yeah, so, I feel like this topic has so much more to actually dive into. This is kind of a surface level, presentation of the discovery so far, but again, as with almost everything we cover on this show, there is so much to dig into, and that's pretty much an inevitability of discussing mysteries on a broad scale like this, right? So, thank you so much. Let's see. Yeah, so hey Andrew Ruiz, I love reading your comments as well, by the way, every week. It's always a pleasure. Andrew says, why do scientists always consider what they learn as fact, only to redact all findings later? Can they not have humility and say, this is what we think is happening at the moment of our current hypothesis? Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the entire basis of what I talked about earlier, poetic thinking, right? And also, okay, so if you've seen a few of my past episodes, I've talked about this also in relation to things like 3I Atlas, right? The interstellar visitor that's gotten science headlines and telescopes around the world kind of in a twist since this past summer. Basically, the point is, some people are saying that it is a space rock, albeit a very unique space rock. Others say that there might be something more to it. But the point of the discussion on the side of the maybe there's something more to it is more like, in my view, keep your mind open. Don't block yourself out of potential opportunities to learn or extend your knowledge or open your mind because you think you have all the answers. You can't analyze or learn anything that way. So I would have to agree. Let's see what else. Yeah, a lot of comments today on that. I couldn't agree more. Oh, another comment from Andrew. Okay, we'll read this too, because I just think this is such a great point. He says, it's frustrating and makes me lose trust in people. Scientists put their ego in front of new discovery and explains this things that have no explanation with our current level of intelligence. Yeah, and that's another great point. Our current level of intelligence. That's a very important caveat when we're talking about all of this, especially with space, right? In this earlier parts of this episode, we talked about the massive scale of a lot of these things, right? We are a very small, pale blue dot in comparison. We have no way to compare our knowledge of our very small little portion inside the solar system and inside the Milky Way that we have seen, right? 170 astronomical units is the farthest we've ever been, right? And obviously that is an unmanned probe. Voyager 1. So taking that into account, our ability to really see what's out there is tremendously limited. We don't even know what is outside our plane of view. So a quick point on this, there's something called the observable universe that gets discussed in these kinds of spheres a lot, right? Basically what that is Earth is at the center of what we can see, obviously. So our ability to observe only so far in the universe. Granted, that distance is immense. However, we actually don't know what's outside of it. And we probably won't know, at least for a very long time, perhaps never. And if you ask me, that's actually a good thing. You know, back to the point of staying curious and staying open-minded and recognizing that we are a small portion of the cosmos. And there is so much beauty and majesty and intrigue out there that we haven't witnessed yet. And that is out there for us to perhaps one day discover. That's amazing. That's something that will inspire people to dive deeper and look closer into mysteries and the parts of the world that we don't understand yet, right? That's my goal. As someone who talks about science and creativity and art and culture on this platform, I want those things to go and inspire the next generation, right? I was once that kid who could not pull my face away from library books and articles and sources of knowledge about things that I didn't understand yet. And I think that's something we need to foster, right? So this kind of modern thinking of believing we know it all doesn't do that. Let's see, checking the chat again. Josh says, poetic thinking, I'm all for it. Me too. Oh, and we have one other comment. Oh, yes. Okay, I'm glad. I love this comment. So from Dog Food, it's a great name, by the way. Notes going haywire means it's not AI generated. Yeah, okay, so I'm really happy I get to make a point of this. So 2 things. I've gotten a few kind of funny comments on some of my videos saying, oh, you know, it's a lot of channels will just have a big team behind them and they'll throw somebody in front of the camera who maybe doesn't know what they're talking about or whatever. I am the only writer, researcher, and obviously presenter of the Codex Legendarium. So everything that you see, for better or worse, it's coming from me. I do my research by hand. That's something I take a huge point of pride in doing. No AI whatsoever. I've done a few videos that you can kind of get the gist of my thoughts on AI, and I have some more ideas for things in that vein coming up, since obviously this is now part of our lives, like it or not. But I like to keep it to a very, very limited, kind of relegated portion of that. I do not believe in letting something else do your creativity for you. And maybe one last quick point I'll make before I wrap this episode up. AI has one really glaring limitation that is not getting talked about enough, which is that it has to train, right? It has to be trained on copious, massive amounts of data, yes, but ultimately it cannot create for itself. It is an entity that can only take bits and pieces and snippets of other things that have already been created by people and then kind of create an amalgamation of that, right? It's not something that can create. And for those of us that are interested in truly engaging with our world and with creating and who are artistically inclined, having something do the creative process for you that isn't even the creative process, I don't think that's something we should be supporting. I don't think that's something that we should let ourselves sink into because, you know, the human brain, the human spirit, if you will, it's a muscle. If you let something else take that from you or do it for you, you know, what are you giving up? I think that's kind of worth a deeper point of reflection. Anyway, that just about wraps it up for this episode. Seriously, thank you all so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to next time. And as always, stay curious and thank you very much.